Roland floated in the dark silence of space, his eyes half open as he watched the dim lights of the control panel blink weakly in front of him. The ship was no longer moving. It had been weeks since the engines had burned their last fuel. He could hear nothing but the faint hum of what little power remained and the slow sound of his breathing inside his helmet. Everything around him felt empty, cold and endless. He had once been part of a research crew sent to study deep space phenomena, but now he was the only one left alive. The others had fallen one by one when the radiation storm hit and destroyed most of the systems. The shields had failed. The navigation had burned and their communication array was gone in seconds, leaving them drifting with no direction. At first, Roland had tried to fix what he could. He had spent days crawling through narrow tunnels, reconnecting wires and patching holes with whatever he could find, but every time he managed to bring one system back, another would fail. The power core was damaged beyond repair and the food reserves were almost gone. His species could go long without eating, but not forever. His body had grown thin and weak. His once bright skin had turned pale and dull. The silence around him was heavy and endless. It pressed on his mind until every second felt like a day. He had recorded messages every morning, hoping someone somewhere would hear him. He didn't know if they reached anyone, but it gave him something to do. It reminded him that he was still alive, even if it didn't feel that way. He would sit by the console, his claws tapping the buttons gently, and speak in a calm, steady tone, though sometimes his voice would break. "I am Roland of the Tehran Exploration. Fleet stranded near Sector 947, coordinates unknown, systems failing." Requesting any response he would say again and again. He would wait for hours after each call, listening to the same empty static. He had almost stopped believing in rescue. Sometimes he would close his eyes and try to imagine his home world. The tall shining towers that reached above the clouds, the blue lakes that glowed at night, and the sound of wind passing through the crystal forests. He could almost feel the warmth of his people, the laughter of his team before everything went wrong. He missed that more than anything, the sound of another living voice. The loneliness was the hardest part. The darkness outside was cold, but the silence inside was worse. He had started writing his story in his personal log, hoping that one day if anyone found the wreck they would know what happened. He didn't want to vanish without leaving a trace. He wrote about the mission, the storm, the moments of fear and loss. He wrote about each crew member by name and how brave they had been. He wanted their story remembered even if no one remembered him. His culture believed that memory gave life meaning, and that a name spoken even once more could keep a soul alive for another cycle. As time passed, Roland began to talk to himself out loud. He would speak to the ship as if it could hear him. He would thank it for keeping him alive for so long. He would tell it stories from his home and about the people he had loved. It was strange, but it helped. He began to think of the ship as a friend, one that shared his pain, one that understood his silence. The cold metal walls seemed less empty when he spoke. One day, while checking the outer sensors, he saw a strange flicker on the screen. It was weak and fading, but it was there. A signal maybe, or just interference. He stared at it for a long time, afraid to believe his own eyes. It appeared again just for a second, then vanished. He quickly adjusted the frequency, hoping to catch it again, but the power was low and the system kept shutting down. He tried to boost the signal with what little energy remained. The screen flashed once more, and a faint pulse of light appeared in the corner of the radar. It was too far to identify, but it wasn't natural. It had rhythm, it had pattern. It was coming from somewhere out there. His hands shook as he adjusted the controls. He sent another distress call, repeating his coordinates and a short message of life confirmation. Then he waited. He didn't move. He didn't blink. He stared at the console, waiting for something to happen, but nothing came. The flicker was gone again, swallowed by the void. He sat there for hours, staring at the empty display until his head dropped forward, and he fell asleep from exhaustion. When he woke up, the lights were dimmer and the air was colder. The power cells had dropped again. He checked the oxygen level and realized he had less than 3 days left. He tried to stay calm, breathing slowly to make the air last longer, but fear kept rising in his chest. He had seen death before, but facing it alone in the dark was something different. There was no honor, no farewell, no one to hold his hand, only silence. He thought about his family, and how they would never know what happened to him. He wished he could send one last message home to tell them not to wait. Hours passed and Roland drifted between sleep and waking. His thoughts were blurry, his body weak. He kept hearing soft echoes, like whispers, but he knew it was only the sound of his mind breaking under the weight of isolation. Then suddenly something new happened. The console beeped once. It was a weak, faint sound, but real. He froze, staring at it in disbelief. The small communication panel that had been silent for weeks was flickering again. A signal not from him this time, but from somewhere else. He leaned closer, pressing his ear to the speaker. The sound was rough, broken, filled with static. But through the noise he heard something that made his heart race. It was a voice not in his language, but a voice that carried tone, rhythm, and warmth. It repeated every few seconds. The translation system tried to catch it, but couldn't fully decode yet. He listened carefully. The voice sounded strong, calm, human. He could hardly breathe. He adjusted the receiver and tapped the response button, sending out a burst of his own signal, repeating the coordinates. He didn't know if they could understand him, but he had to try. He waited for a reply, and it came back after a few seconds, clearer this time. The words were still distorted, but the tone was unmistakable. It was someone out there calling through the void. Someone had heard him. Tears filled his eyes. He pressed the console and whispered a thank you in his language. He didn't know who they were or if they were even real. But in that moment, hope returned to him stronger than ever before. He kept sending replies until his voice became too weak to speak. Then he leaned back in his chair and stared out at the stars. They no longer looked like cold, distant fires. They looked alive, as if they too were watching him. He thought about what kind of beings they might be. The voice had sounded rough and deep, not like any of his own species. He had heard stories about humans from the outer colonies. His people considered them reckless and unpredictable, but also brave. Some said they were dangerous. Others said they were kind. No one had ever met one in person before. Maybe it was only a myth, but now it didn't matter. If they were coming, they were his only hope. He checked his life support once more, counting the hours he had left. The oxygen was still dropping, but he no longer felt the same fear. Instead, there was a strange calm inside him. For the first time in many weeks, he believed he might not die alone. He closed his eyes and imagined a ship approaching a bright vessel, cutting through the dark, carrying voices, laughter light. He imagined seeing faces that were not his own and hearing words of comfort. He stayed awake as long as he could, waiting for another message. Sometimes the signal grew stronger. Sometimes it faded completely. But each time it returned, he smiled weakly, whispering to it like an old friend, "Come closer, please don't stop." He didn't know if they could hear him, but he wanted to believe that they could. As the hours turned into another long cycle, Roland's body grew colder. He wrapped himself in a blanket from the supply box and watched tiny ice crystals form on the inside of the window. The stars outside looked like silver dust scattered across black velvet. Each one seemed to pulse with a slow rhythm, as if breathing with him. He began to talk to them softly, telling them his name, his story, his dreams. He told them about his crew and how brave they were. He told them about his home world, the way the sun rose over the shining waters, and how his people would sing when it did. He spoke until his voice faded into whispers. Then once again the console beeped, a stronger signal this time. The same voice, but clearer than before. He didn't understand the words, but the tone was full of urgency and emotion. It repeated several times, then paused, then came again, faster now. He tried to respond, but his transmitter was weak. He sent one last burst of his coordinates and his name. Then the lights on the console dimmed completely and everything went dark. Roland sat quietly in the darkness, listening to the echo of the last sound. The silence returned, but it felt different this time. Softer, warmer. Like the space around him had changed. He closed his eyes and whispered, "Thank you," in his broken voice. He didn't know if the signal would reach anyone or if the humans were already on their way, but somewhere deep inside he felt certain that he had been heard, and that was enough for now. The vast cold of space seemed less empty, and the darkness less frightening as he drifted into sleep with a faint smile on his face and the memory of a distant human voice still echoing in his mind. Captain Eli Grant sat in the command chair of the UHS Horizon, a human patrol ship that had been on routine deep space watch for almost 3 months. The crew was tired, restless, and eager to return home, but the silence of space was never forgiving. Grant stared at the control panels before him, the faint green light from the screens reflecting off his tired eyes. He was a man of discipline, but also one who followed his instincts, and his instincts told him something wasn't right. The navigator called out that there was an unusual signal coming from the far edge of their range. It was faint, broken, and didn't match any known human transmission. Grant leaned forward, studying the data stream. It pulsed in an uneven rhythm, weak but repeating over and over. Most of the crew dismissed it as static or a damaged satellite, but Grant didn't. He had heard too many strange stories during his years in command about signals that were ignored until it was too late. He ordered the crew to record the frequency and strengthen the reception. The communication officer frowned and said it could take hours, maybe even a day, to get a clear lock. Grant simply said, "Do it," as they worked. The Horizon continued its silent glide through the dark sea of stars. The hum of the engines was steady. The low vibration felt under every step. The crew moved quietly, each focused on their tasks. But Grant could feel the growing curiosity among them. Deep space patrol was mostly uneventful, and anything new, even a mystery signal, was enough to break the monotony. When the first partial recording came through the ship's speakers, everyone turned to listen. It was distorted, a mix of static and strange tones, but within the noise was something faint, almost like a voice. It didn't sound human. The tone was softer, slower, and there was an odd rhythm to it. The translation program couldn't decode it fully, but one word came through clear. Help. Grant's jaw tightened. He looked at the others, who stared back, uncertain. Some whispered that it might be an old automated distress beacon from one of the earlier colonies. Others thought it might be a trick and echo from their own systems, but Grant felt the truth deep down. Someone was out there. He asked for the location. The navigator reported that the signal was coming from beyond the navigation border, an uncharted sector with no known routes or colonies. The comms officer added that going there would take them off course and risk their return path. Grant didn't care. He gave the order to change direction. The crew hesitated for a moment, but they trusted him enough not to question. For long hours passed as the Horizon altered its route. The stars outside shifted their pattern as the ship entered deeper into uncharted space. The further they went, the weaker the signal became, until it almost faded completely. Grant refused to turn back. He told the crew to keep the scanners wide open and the communication channel alive. The tension on the bridge grew heavier. The air felt different when they crossed into the region where no beacon, no trade ship, and no communication line had ever reached. Grant sat quietly thinking about the voice he had heard. He remembered the days when he had joined the Space Corps, full of hope and curiosity about what lay beyond human knowledge. Now, after years of service, he still felt the same. Whenever a new discovery appeared, even if it came wrapped in danger. He had lost people before and had seen the cost of deep space missions. But something inside him couldn't ignore a call for help. He didn't know who or what was waiting, but the sound of that voice had stirred something deeply human in him. In the engineering section, the chief technician worked on boosting the receiver gain while complaining softly about how every time they followed strange readings they ended up in trouble, but even he couldn't hide his own curiosity. The ship's medic prepared extra oxygen masks and emergency kits just in case. The rest of the crew spoke in hushed tones about what the voice could be. Some joked about alien ghosts, others said it might be survivors from an ancient mission lost to history. But when the captain walked by, they all grew quiet because his focus was unshakable. and his silence carried weight. After almost 12 hours of travel through dark, empty space, the scanners picked up a faint reflection, a small metallic object drifting slowly with no visible power signature. The navigator called out the coordinates and Grant ordered full stop. The ship slowed its engines to a low hum as they approached. The object came into view on the screen first as a tiny dot, then growing larger until it filled the monitor. It was a vessel old and heavily damaged with strange markings along its hull unlike anything in human databases. The crew stared in awe and fear. The ship looked broken in half with dark scorch marks running across its surface. Grant stood up and leaned closer to the screen. There were no lights, no movement, nothing that suggested life. But he knew this was the source of the signal. He ordered a scanning sweep. The results showed minimal power still active and a weak energy reading in one compartment, possibly life support barely running. Everyone exchanged uncertain looks. The medic whispered that it was impossible for anyone to survive that long in a dead ship. Grant didn't answer. He just said, "Prepare the boarding pod." The co-pilot tried to reason with him, saying it could be dangerous. There could be contamination or traps. Grant simply said, "If there's even one being alive in there, we go. We're human, that's what we do." His words silenced any further debate. The crew prepared the pod, sealing themselves into suits and checking each oxygen level. Grant led the small team himself, as he always did when it came to first contact or rescue missions. The pod launched slowly, separating from the horizon and gliding toward the dead alien vessel. The silence between the two ships was deep and heavy, broken only by the soft hum of their thrusters. Through the viewing window they could see the massive structure ahead, drifting like a dark monument in the endless void. Its metal skin reflected the faint light from distant stars. The boarding lights flickered across its surface, showing signs of heavy damage, pieces of the hull torn away, exposing wires and frozen fragments. When they reached the airlock, they found it partly open with no power inside. Grant ordered manual entry. The team pushed through the heavy door and floated into the darkness. The air was stale, cold, and thick with dust. The beams of their flashlights cut through the gloom, revealing strange alien symbols on the walls. The design of the ship was unlike anything human. The corridors were curved, almost organic, like the inside of a living creature. Grant moved forward slowly, listening to the quiet hiss of their breathing systems. Every step echoed through the metal floor. Then they found a chamber, with faint light still glowing from a small panel near the wall. The energy reading came. From there, inside the chamber, lay a figure, thin, motionless, wrapped in a torn suit. It didn't look human. Its body was longer and more slender. Its skin pale with a faint shimmer. Its chest moved, barely noticeable. The medic gasped. "It's alive." Grant knelt beside the creature, checking the readings on his scanner. The oxygen in the room was thin, but the being was still breathing very slowly. He lifted its arm gently, feeling for any pulse, and then called back to the horizon, requesting immediate medical evacuation. The crew moved quickly, setting up the portable chamber and sealing the alien inside it to keep pressure and temperature stable. As they worked, one of the officers noticed a small recording device near the seat. Grant picked it up carefully and slipped it into his suit pocket. They made their way back to the pod and launched toward the horizon. The silence inside the pod was heavy. Everyone kept looking at the creature floating inside the chamber, its face calm but fragile. The medic kept checking the vitals, whispering to herself that it was a miracle it was even alive. When they finally docked with the horizon, the crew watched from behind the glass as the rescue team carried the alien to the medical bay. Grant followed them, his expression calm but his mind racing. He had seen many things during his years, but nothing like this. The thought that another intelligent being existed beyond humanity was not new, but to find one alive was something else entirely. The crew gathered in the observation deck, watching the medics work. Some looked scared, some amazed, some emotional. In the med bay, the lights were dim and the air filled with the soft beeping of machines. The alien's chest moved steadily now, its breathing stronger. Its skin had a faint glow under the light. Grant stood near the window, quietly observing. He didn't feel fear, only curiosity and respect. He knew that somewhere out there a being had been alone in the dark, calling for help, and that call had reached them against all odds as the horizon resumed steady orbit. The communication officer replayed the last part of the alien signal, now that they had better decoding. It was clearer this time. The translation system finally caught the words, repeating again and again, "I am Roland, stranded life fading. Please help Grant." Listened in silence, then turned to his crew and said, "We found him just in time." The crew exchanged looks, realizing what they had accomplished. They hadn't just answered a signal, they had reached across the cold void of space and proven something about themselves, about what it meant to be human. They had risked their safety for someone they didn't know, someone not even of their kind. Grant didn't speak much, but his heart felt heavy with pride as he watched the alien resting peacefully on the bed, surrounded by the hum of human machines and the soft rhythm of life returning where there had once been only silence. Roland woke up slowly, his eyes opening. To a soft white light that stung at first, he felt heavy and warm, which was strange because he had not felt warmth for a long time. For a moment he thought he was still dreaming. The soft hum around him sounded like a ship, but smoother, more stable, than his own. He blinked again, trying to move, but his body felt weak. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted them to his face. The skin on his arms looked pale and dry, but his breathing was easier than before. Then he heard a voice. It was low, deep, and not in his language. He turned his head and saw a figure standing near the edge of the room, wearing a strange suit with smooth black fabric and a clear mask. The man spoke again slowly, this time softer. Roland couldn't understand the words, but the tone was kind, gentle. He felt no threat, only curiosity. Another person entered the room holding a small glowing device and began checking the readings on a panel near his bed. They moved carefully, as if they didn't want to frighten him. Roland realized then that these were not his people. He was looking at humans, the ones he had only heard about in stories. For years his world had spoken of humans as a young, reckless species full of courage, but also danger. They were said to be unpredictable, always chasing exploration and risk. But now, lying there in a clean room, breathing air that didn't burn his lungs, he began to wonder if those stories were wrong. These humans had saved him, they had brought him aboard their ship and given him life again. Captain Grant watched from behind a transparent screen as the alien slowly sat up. The medical officer beside him nodded, saying the readings were stable. The creature, or rather the being, had survived against impossible odds. Grant had seen dead men come back with less chance than that. He stepped forward, slowly entering the medbay without his helmet this time to show trust. The room was quiet, except for the hum of machines and the soft beep of monitors. Roland turned his head as Grant approached. The human's face looked strange to him, angular and strong, with eyes that seemed both cautious and kind. Grant stopped a few feet away, raising his hand slowly, palm open, a gesture of peace. Roland hesitated, then copied the motion slowly. His fingers shook, but he managed a weak smile. Grant didn't know if the alien understood the gesture, but the small motion felt like the first bridge between two worlds. The medic adjusted the translator, a small cube sitting near Roland's bed. It flickered as it tried to match their speech patterns. Grant spoke softly, saying, "You are safe. You are aboard the Horizon." The words came out broken through the translator, but Roland could pick up enough meaning to understand safe, yes. He whispered, his voice rough from dehydration. "Thank you." The translator repeated his words in human tongue, and the room went silent for a moment, as the crew realized they were actually communicating. Grant asked his name, and after a pause, Roland answered slowly. "My name is Roland. I was part of a Tehran exploration vessel." The translator repeated the message, and Grant nodded. "We heard your signal. You were lucky we found you." In time, Roland looked around, his eyes wide, taking in every detail of the human technology. The walls were smooth metal lined with lights that seemed to breathe like living stars. The air smelled different but clean. There was warmth, a steady temperature, something he hadn't felt since before the storm. He wanted to ask many questions, but his body was still weak. The medic offered him a small container with clear water. He hesitated for a second, then took a sip. It was colder than anything he had ever tasted, and it brought tears to his eyes. He whispered another thank you, Barely able to hold back the emotion, Grant watched quietly, feeling a strange sense of respect for the creature before him. This was no monster, no danger. This was someone who had faced death alone and survived. Later, when Roland was strong enough to stand, the crew brought him to the observation deck. From there, he could see the vast expanse of space spread before him like an endless sea. Stars glimmered in every direction, and for a moment he felt both small and alive again. The humans stood near him, watching his reaction. One of them pointed at a bright blue light far in the distance and said softly, "That's Earth, our home." Roland turned his head, slowly studying the blue light. It was beautiful, gentle, and alive. He nodded slowly and whispered. Home communication remained difficult, but every day the translator learned more words, and soon they could talk in short sentences. Roland told them about his ship, about how the storm had destroyed everything, and how he had sent signals for weeks with no reply until theirs came. He spoke of his people, their world, and their belief that life should always be preserved, no matter the cost. The humans listened with quiet respect. Some taking notes, others simply listening because his voice carried a sense of sadness and wisdom that needed no translation. In return, Grant told him about humanity, their endless search for discovery, their mistakes and their hopes. He explained that many people back home still doubted the existence of other intelligent life. Roland smiled weakly, saying, "Now they will know." The captain smiled too, saying, "They will know because of you." As days passed, Roland began to walk again, his body still fragile but healing. He often wandered the ship, slowly touching the walls as if memorizing them. The crew got used to seeing him moving quietly among them. Some of them were still nervous, unsure how to act around a being from another world, but most treated him with kindness. They offered him food, water, and even tried to teach him simple words from their language. He learned quickly, repeating the words "thank you" and "friend" with an accent that made everyone smile. One evening he sat in the mess hall watching the humans eat and talk. They laughed loudly, their voices echoing through the room. He found it strange but comforting. Their laughter reminded him of his own crew before the storm. He missed them deeply, but being among these humans filled part of that emptiness. He realized that no matter what species someone was, laughter sounded the same. Warm and alive, Grant joined him that night, sitting across the table. He handed Roland a small metallic cup filled with warm liquid and said, "It's called coffee, careful, it's strong." Roland took a sip and nearly coughed the taste. Bitter but oddly pleasant. Grant chuckled and said, "You'll get used to it." After a long pause, Roland asked softly, "Why did you come for me? Your people did not know me." Grant looked out the window for a moment before answering. "Because you called for help and we could help. That's enough reason." Roland thought about that in silence. The simplicity of the answer touched him deeply. Later that night, as he returned to his quarters, he looked out the window again. The stars seemed brighter from the horizon's view. He thought of his world and wondered if they could see him from there, if they knew he was alive. He decided that even if he never returned home, his story would live because these humans had found him, and that act would echo far beyond either of their worlds. The next morning, the ship experienced a small tremor as they passed through a debris field. The alarm sounded briefly and the lights flickered. Roland jumped from his seat, startled. The humans moved fast, sealing doors and adjusting shields within seconds. Their calm efficiency impressed him. He realized that these people had mastered survival through constant danger. They worked together, trusting one another completely. That trust was their strength. After the situation settled, the captain came to check on him. Roland asked if they were safe. Grant nodded, saying, "We are, but we need to make repairs before continuing." Roland offered his help, though he knew little of human machines. The captain smiled, saying, "You rest. That's the best help you can give for now." But Roland couldn't rest. He walked to the viewing deck again, staring at the stars, thinking about everything he had learned about these humans. They were loud, impulsive, stubborn, and brave. They didn't always think before acting, but when they did act, they did so with heart. He began to understand why his people both feared and admired them. They were unpredictable, but their compassion was real. That night, as most of the crew slept, Roland stayed awake staring at the faint reflection of himself in the glass. He whispered softly. To his reflection, words from his culture meant for the spirits of the lost I have been found. He said they heard me across the dark. They came when no one else did, and they shared their light. The translator picked up the sound, repeating it softly. In human language behind him, Grant, who had been passing by, stopped listening quietly. He didn't say anything, but his chest felt tight with emotion. He knew those words were a gift, a sign of trust that went deeper than any treaty in the following. Days Roland's health continued to improve, and his bond with the crew grew stronger. He helped them adjust a few systems, sharing small pieces of his people's technology that could improve efficiency. The engineers were amazed and grateful. The atmosphere on the horizon changed slightly. Less tense, more hopeful. They no longer saw Roland as an alien. They saw him as part of the crew. As the ship continued its journey back to human space, Roland spent long hours talking with Grant. They spoke about fear, hope, and the meaning of survival. They discovered that though they came from different stars, their hearts beat for the same things: life, purpose, and connection. On the final day of that journey segment, Roland stood once more at the observation deck. The stars stretched endlessly before him, and the blue light of Earth shone brighter than before. He placed his hand on the glass, whispering softly to himself. I was alone in the dark, and then a voice came through the stars. That voice was human, and it saved me. He smiled gently, the first true smile he had made since the storm, knowing deep inside that this was only the beginning of something greater than either of them could imagine. Roland began to feel stronger. With each passing day, and his body started to recover from the long period of isolation. The humans treated him with care and patience, as if he were one of their own. His steps became steadier, his eyes brighter, and his voice no longer trembled when he spoke. The translator device had improved so much that he could now hold small conversations with the crew. His words were slow but clear, and every day he learned something new about the strange language of these humans. They too seemed fascinated by him, and often asked gentle questions about his people, their cities, and their way of life. He tried to explain as best as he could, using gestures and drawings on a small screen to show them what his home looked like. The humans listened with interest, their eyes full of curiosity and wonder. One morning, Captain Grant invited Roland to visit the control deck. The doors slid open, and Roland stepped inside, looking around with wide eyes. The room was filled with screens, buttons, and glowing lights. The soft hum of the engines echoed in the air, and the large window showed the endless sea of stars stretching far beyond what his mind could measure. Grant stood near the center, giving orders to his officers. In calm, short words, when he noticed Roland, he smiled slightly and waved him closer. Roland walked carefully, trying not to touch anything. He had seen control rooms before, but this one felt alive. There was movement, purpose, and warmth. The humans spoke in firm, confident tones as they worked together, checking systems and adjusting navigation routes. It was like watching a living machine made of many hearts beating in rhythm. Grant handed him a small headset and pointed at the window, saying, quietly, "That is where we are heading." The translator took a moment before repeating the words. Roland looked outside and saw a faint, glowing curve of light, a distant nebula that shimmered like dust caught in sunlight. It was beautiful. Grant explained that they were crossing near a storm field and needed to navigate carefully. Roland nodded, understanding how dangerous such storms could be. He offered to help by reading the radiation data through his own senses, since his species could detect certain frequencies better than humans. The captain agreed with gratitude, and soon Roland stood beside the crew, reading signals and reporting the changes. The team listened to him closely, trusting his observations as if he were one of them. When the storm passed safely, the crew cheered and clapped their hands. Grant turned to Roland and said, "You just saved us some trouble." Roland smiled shyly, not used to such open joy. The humans laughed and patted his shoulder, their laughter filling the room with warmth. For a moment he forgot that they were different species. He only felt that he belonged there among them. Days went by, and Roland spent more time with the humans, learning their habits and small ways of living. He watched how they shared food, How they teased each other, how they argued and then laughed again. He found their emotions loud and expressive, very different from his people who spoke softly and valued calmness. Yet he liked it. Their energy was alive and full of heart. It reminded him that life was not only about surviving, but also about feeling and sharing. Even the smallest gestures meant something here, like when one crew member handed him a blanket during a cold night shift, or when the medic brought him a warm drink after long hours of translation work. At night he often sat by the window of his small cabin looking at the stars. He thought about how strange it was that fate had placed him here with these humans. They could have ignored his signal. They could have stayed on their path and left him to die, but they didn't. That thought filled him with deep respect. He began writing notes in his language about what he saw and felt, hoping to record every moment for his people, if he ever returned home. He wanted them to know what humans were truly like, not from rumors or fear, but from truth and experience. One evening as he was writing, there was a soft knock on his door. Captain Grant stepped in carrying a small device. He said softly, "I thought, you might want to see this." He placed the device on the table and pressed a button. A small hologram appeared showing Earth rotating slowly, blue and white under the light of its sun. Roland stared at it in silence. The sight was breathtaking. It looked alive and warm and fragile. He reached out slowly, touching the edge of the image with trembling fingers, and whispered, "Beautiful." Grant nodded, saying, "That's our home. Everything we fight for and everything we come back to." Roland looked at him and asked, "Do you miss it?" Grant smiled a little. "Always, but out here it's different. You start to see how big everything really is and how small we are, but it also reminds you why life matters." Roland thought about those words long after Grant left. Later that night, the ship encountered a small mechanical problem. A cooling pipe in the lower deck had burst, causing heat levels to rise. The engineers worked quickly, but one of the sensors failed to locate the damaged section. Roland offered to help again using his natural ability to sense vibrations. He followed the faint hum of the ship and located the area where the damage was worst, guiding the humans with precision. The repair took less than an hour, and the captain thanked him again. This time Roland didn't feel shy. He smiled with quiet pride, knowing he had truly become part of their team. The days turned into weeks, and soon, Roland and Grant shared many quiet conversations in the observation room. They spoke about their people and the way each saw the universe. Roland explained how his kind believed that every life form was connected through the energy of creation, that to harm one was to harm all. Grant listened with respect and shared how humans still struggled with that idea, sometimes learning it the hard way through mistakes, wars, and losses. Yet he also said that they never stopped trying to be better. Roland admired that kind of honesty. One day, a young crew member asked him what he thought of humans. He took a long pause before answering, "You are full of fire, sometimes too much. But it is a warm fire, not cold. You risk yourselves for others, even strangers. That is a rare thing in the universe." The crew member smiled proudly at his words. As time went on, Roland's connection with the humans grew stronger. He no longer saw them as separate or strange. He saw them as individuals with hearts that beat just like his. He learned their humor, their sadness, and their kindness. He even began to understand the small words they used to comfort each other, and sometimes he used them too. When a mechanic dropped a tool inside, Roland said softly, "It's okay, we fix together." The mechanic laughed and nodded, calling him a fast learner. One quiet afternoon, the captain received a message from Earth Command. They had to prepare for a return trip, but their fuel levels were lower than expected. The crew began calculating routes that would conserve energy. Roland listened quietly, then offered to share a navigation method from his people, one that used gravitational fields to shorten travel without burning much fuel. The engineers studied his idea and found it could work with minor adjustments. They followed his suggestion, and soon the Horizon system showed improved readings. The captain looked at him with surprise and said, "You may have just saved us weeks?" Roland replied with a small smile, You saved me first." In the following days, he noticed how the humans began to include him naturally in their daily work. They asked his opinion during briefings and even invited him to join meals at the captain's table. During one of those meals, Grant told a story about his first mission as a young officer when he had almost lost his ship but was saved by the quick thinking of his crew. He said leadership meant nothing without trust and teamwork. Roland listened carefully, thinking how similar that was to his own people's beliefs, though expressed in different words at night. As the stars drifted by outside, he found himself reflecting on everything he had seen and felt. The humans were not perfect. They made mistakes. They argued, they doubted, but they also forgave and kept moving forward. That strength touched something deep within him. It made him believe again that survival was not just about holding on, but about connecting and growing. As the ship drew closer to human space, the mood among the crew became lighter. Everyone was excited to return home and tell their story. But for Roland, there was a quiet sadness. He had come to love this strange ship and the beings who had saved him. He knew his time with them might soon end. Yet he was grateful for every moment, every time he passed someone in the corridor. They smiled and greeted him warmly. He had become more than a guest, he was a friend. On the last evening before entering communication range with Earth, Grant stood beside him on the viewing deck. The planet glowed faintly. In the distance, wrapped in blue light, Grant said softly, "Soon everyone will know about you and your people. This is history." Roland nodded slowly, saying, "I hope they see not fear, but friendship." Grant replied, "I'll make sure they do." They stood, in silence, watching the stars drift past. The vastness of space stretched before them, endless and cold. But in that moment it didn't feel lonely. It felt alive, filled with connection and meaning. Roland realized then that his story was no longer about being abandoned in deep space. It was about being found not just by a ship, but by something far greater. The spirit of humanity that refused to let any voice go unheard. He closed his eyes and whispered words of peace in his language, hoping the stars would carry them to his lost crew and to every soul still waiting in the dark. When the horizon finally entered the outer zone of human space, the crew was filled with excitement. Every corridor buzzed with voices and movement as people prepared reports, fixed systems, and cleaned the ship for inspection. Roland watched all this with quiet wonder. He had never seen such joy before. It was not only because they were going home, but because they had done something extraordinary. They had rescued someone from the far unknown and lived to tell about it. For them, it was more than duty. It was proof of what humanity stood for. Captain Grant spent hours sending coded messages to Earth Command explaining their mission and asking for a secure arrival zone. Roland sat near the communication deck watching the humans work with calm focus. The screens flashed with data and signals, and he could hear the faint hum of transmissions passing through the air. Grant turned to him and said, "It might take some time for them to process everything." Roland nodded, saying quietly, "I understand your world must prepare to see someone like me." Grant gave a small smile and said, "They will handle it. You are not the first new life we have met, but you might be the first we brought home." As days passed, the ship slowed down, and the stars outside began to shift from endless darkness to clusters of brighter light, meaning they were near planetary regions. The sight made Roland's chest feel heavy with mixed emotions. He felt grateful for his rescue, yet uncertain about what awaited him on Earth. Would they treat him with kindness or fear? Would they see him as a person or just a strange being? He didn't know, but he trusted Grant and the crew. Their kindness had never failed him. During those final days, Roland became even closer to the crew. He helped them organize data from the journey and translated parts of his knowledge for the science team. He drew maps of his lost colony and explained how his people navigated using light patterns instead of mechanical instruments. The humans listened with great interest, taking notes and asking gentle questions. In return, he asked about Earth, what it looked like, what it felt like to breathe its air, and what it meant to belong there. The stories they told him painted vivid pictures of oceans, forests, cities, and children playing under open skies. He closed, his eyes trying to imagine such beauty. One evening as they neared the solar system, the ship encountered a communication signal from a nearby patrol vessel. The message was full of static, but the words were clear. Horizon, you are entering secure. Space, identify your passenger. Grant responded firmly. This is Captain Grant of the Horizon. We have an alien survivor on board. Friendly, non-hostile, requesting safe passage. The channel went silent for a long moment. Then a calm voice answered. Copy. That captain, proceed with caution. Escort will meet you soon. The crew sighed with relief, but Roland felt a sudden wave of nervousness. When the escort ships appeared, they looked sleek and silver, like metallic birds flying in perfect formation. Their presence made Roland feel both safe and small. Grant explained that it was standard protocol for first contact missions to ensure safety for both sides. The Horizon followed the escort through a long path toward Earth, passing through defense, grids, and relay stations. The sight of Earth slowly appeared ahead, blue-white and alive, spinning gently in space. It was the most beautiful thing Roland had ever seen. He stood at the window in silence, his eyes full of awe. The humans around him smiled proudly at the sight of their home. When they finally entered orbit, the command center contacted them again, instructing the crew to dock at a research station on the moon's surface for quarantine and observation. Grant turned to Roland and said, You'll be treated with respect, they just need to make sure everything is safe. Roland nodded, understanding completely. He knew it was natural for them to be careful. He trusted them enough not to feel afraid. The landing was smooth. The lunar station was bright, clean, and full of light. The corridors were quiet and lined with glass walls showing different sections where scientists worked. Roland walked beside Grant, surrounded by a small group of guards, not as prisoners but as protectors guiding him through the unknown. He was given a private room with transparent walls and comfortable furniture, far better than what he had on the Horizon. The humans told him it was for his comfort and safety. He thanked them softly through the translator and promised to cooperate fully. Over the next few days, scientists and diplomats visited him, asking gentle questions about his origin, his technology, and his people. He answered honestly, but always carefully explaining only what he felt was safe for both sides. He didn't want humans to misuse anything his people had created. He spoke of peace, cooperation, and understanding. The scientists seemed fascinated not only by his knowledge but by his calm nature. One of them, a young woman named Dr. Lane, told him that his story would change history. Roland replied quietly, I only hope it changes hearts. Meanwhile, Captain Grant stayed close, visiting him often to make sure he felt comfortable. During one visit, Grant told him that news of his rescue had spread across the world. Some people were amazed, some afraid, but most were curious. The government planned to broadcast a statement soon introducing Roland as a symbol of peace and interstellar friendship. Roland felt both honored and nervous. He didn't want to be treated like a display, but he trusted Grant's judgment. When the day came, the broadcast took place in a large chamber filled with cameras and lights. Grant stood beside Roland and spoke calmly about their journey, how they found him abandoned in deep space, and how cooperation had saved both sides. He said that Roland represented not only another world but also the best part of humanity, their compassion and courage. When it was Roland's turn to speak, he took a deep breath and said through the translator, I was lost, alone with no hope. I sent a message into the void, not knowing if anyone would hear me. But you did. You reached out across the darkness, not to conquer, but to help. That is something rare in the universe. I thank you for showing me that light can exist even in deep space. His words were simple, but they carried emotion that touched everyone watching. The room fell silent for a moment, then filled with quiet applause. Grant placed a hand on his shoulder and said, Welcome to Earth, Roland. The following days, he became a guest of honor at the research facility. People from all around the world sent messages of goodwill. Some asked about his world, others simply thanked him for proving that peace between species was possible. He spent hours recording his experiences, helping scientists understand his biology and teaching them about his people's ways of healing and communication. He was fascinated by human art and music, especially the sounds of instruments that reminded him of the winds that once passed through his home city. At night, when the lights dimmed, he often sat by the glass wall looking at Earth hanging in the distance. He thought of his lost crew, and wondered if some of them might still be out there waiting for rescue. The thought made his heart ache, but he found comfort in knowing that if any of them sent a signal one day, perhaps humans would answer just as they had answered him one day. Grant visited again with good news. The council had decided to allow Roland to help lead a joint mission to search for survivors of his people using combined human and alien technology. It was a rare gesture of trust and hope. Roland's eyes shone with emotion. He stood and said quietly, "Thank you not just for me, but for all who are lost." Grant smiled and said, "It's time we stop being alone in the universe." Together they began preparing plans for the next mission. The scientists worked side by side with Roland, learning his methods of signal tracing and long-distance communication. They built a new scanner based on his guidance capable of detecting energy frequencies used by his people. Roland spent long hours helping them refine it, his hands moving with skill and precision as if he were rebuilding a piece of home. The humans watched in admiration. During those days he noticed something beautiful. The humans never treated him like a specimen. They treated him like a teacher, a partner, and a friend. They invited him to eat with them, to laugh with them, and sometimes to simply sit in silence watching the stars. Together they shared not only technology but also hope and stories about life. Roland realized that what had started as a rescue had become something far deeper, a bond that crossed the limits of species and distance. Finally, after weeks of preparation, the new ship stood ready. It was a mix of human design and alien innovation, sleek, strong, and capable of long travel. Grant looked at it proudly and said, "We built this together." Roland nodded, feeling a deep sense of pride. It was no longer just about survival. It was about connection. As he stood before the ship, ready for another journey, he looked once more at the blue planet below. He whispered words in his language, words of peace and gratitude. The humans around him didn't understand the words, but they felt the meaning in his tone. It was a promise that the bond they had created would not be forgotten. When the engines roared to life, Roland felt his heart steady. He was no longer the being who had drifted alone in space, waiting for death. He was part of something greater. He looked at Grant, who stood beside him, and said, softly, "You found me when I was lost, now let us find others together." Grant smiled and nodded, saying, "That's exactly what we'll do." As the ship lifted from the lunar surface and turned toward the stars, Roland watched Earth fade into the distance. The light from its oceans and clouds shimmered like a living jewel in the darkness. He knew he would return someday, but for now his path lay beyond, toward the unknown once again. But this time he was not alone. He had a new family among the stars, and a new purpose to bring hope to those still waiting in the silence. The new ship moved through the dark sea of space with smooth grace, its engines humming. Softly like a heartbeat, Roland stood near the main window, watching the endless stars pass by. His eyes reflected the light of distant suns, and his face held both calm and hope. Captain Grant was beside him, checking the readings on the navigation panel. The crew around them worked quietly, but there was a quiet energy in the air. Everyone knew they were part of something bigger than themselves. This mission was not only about finding Roland's people, it was about proving that cooperation between worlds was real. The ship was named Unity, a name that made everyone proud. It was a mix of human strength and alien knowledge, a symbol of trust. Every part of it showed that both sides had learned from each other. The walls were lighter, though power systems more efficient, and the communication tools stronger than anything used before. Roland had designed a special scanner based on his people's old signal patterns, and it was now their best hope for finding any survivors. For the first few weeks, the journey was calm. The crew moved through daily routines, testing systems, adjusting routes, and gathering data. Roland spent hours in the lab studying the signal waves that came from distant points in the galaxy. Sometimes he stayed there so long that Grant had to remind him to rest. Roland would smile softly and say, "I cannot rest when the stars might be calling." He felt a deep connection to the space around them, as if the void itself was whispering fragments of memory. One night, when most of the crew had gone to their quarters, Roland stayed awake watching the scanner screens. A faint pulse appeared on one of the displays. It was weak, irregular, but different from any natural pattern. He leaned closer, his heart beating faster. He ran the signal through translation filters, and after a few minutes he was certain it was a distress call, coded in the ancient pattern of his people. He quickly called Grant and the crew back to the deck. When they arrived, he pointed at the screen and said softly, "This is one of us." The room fell silent for a moment, then Grant ordered full focus on the coordinates. They changed course immediately, heading toward the outer rim of a forgotten system. The closer they got, the stronger the signal became, but it was still faint, as if it came from something damaged. After several hours, they reached the edge of a small asteroid field and found what looked like the remains of a ship, half buried in floating rocks. The hull was cracked and burnt, but a faint light still blinked near its side. Roland stared at it with tears in his eyes. He whispered, "That is one of ours." Grant ordered the ship to approach carefully, using drones to scan for danger. Once they confirmed it was safe, Roland and a small rescue team suited up and left the Unity. They floated through the silence, their lights cutting through the darkness. When Roland touched the surface of the wrecked ship, he felt a strange vibration through his gloves. It was weak but alive. He opened a small panel and used his device to send a signal in his language. After a long pause, a faint reply came back, a single word meaning help. They forced open the main hatch and entered the wreck. The inside was cold and filled with shadows, pieces of broken equipment floating in the air. But there, near the back of the main chamber, they found a survival pod barely functioning. Inside it was a figure, weak, thin, and breathing slowly. Roland's eyes widened as he recognized the markings on the survivor's suit. It was from his colony. He pressed his hand to the pod window and said softly in his language, "You are safe now." The figure opened tired eyes and whispered his name. The rescue team brought the survivor back to the Unity quickly. The medics worked with both human and alien techniques to stabilize the being's life signs. Roland stayed beside the bed, holding the survivor's hand, whispering words of comfort. When the being finally opened their eyes again, they looked around in confusion at the human faces. Roland explained everything slowly, telling them how he had been found and saved, how he had worked with these humans to search for others. The survivor listened quietly and then nodded, whispering, "You kept the light alive." Grant and the crew watched from the corner, giving them space. The sight moved everyone deeply. They knew they were witnessing a moment of history, the meeting of two worlds joined not by fear, but by compassion. The survivor, whose name was Kale, began to recover quickly with the help of the ship's doctors. Soon he was strong enough to speak to the humans directly through the translator. He told them that his ship had been lost many years ago when they were searching for other colonies. He had stayed alive using the last of their power, but thought no one would ever find him. When he learned that it was humans who had saved them, he was silent for a long time before saying, "You reached us across the endless dark. That is something I will never forget." Over the next few days, Kale helped Roland and the crew analyze old data from his ship. They discovered records of other potential colonies that might still exist in hidden sectors. The idea filled everyone with renewed purpose. They realized this mission could become something greater than rescue. It could become the bridge between two civilizations. Roland looked at Grant and said softly, "We began with one signal. Now, there are many, waiting." Grant nodded, saying, "Then we will keep searching until we find them all." Their next goal took them to a nearby star system where more traces of alien technology were found. On the way, Kale spent time learning about the humans just as Roland once had. He was surprised by their warmth and their curiosity. He said to Roland one day, "They are not what I expected. I thought they would see us as strange or dangerous, but they see us as friends." Roland smiled and replied, "That is what they taught me too." The Unity became a home shared by both races. Humans and aliens worked together in every part of the ship, fixing systems, sharing meals, even laughing at small mistakes. The differences between them started to fade, replaced by a sense of shared purpose. Each day brought them closer not only to finding others but to understanding themselves better. Through Roland's calm wisdom and Grant's steady leadership, the crew became more like a family than a team. One quiet evening, Grant sat with Roland in the observation room looking out at the stars. He said, "You know, when we found you, I didn't think it would change everything the way it did." Roland looked at him and replied, "You changed more than one life that day. You changed the path of two worlds." Grant nodded thoughtfully, saying, "Maybe that's what humanity was meant to do. Not just to explore, but to connect." Roland smiled, saying, "And that is the true meaning of life among the stars." As they continued their search, the Unity sent regular updates back to Earth and to the new alien communication network, forming near their home world. Messages of peace and cooperation spread across both planets, inspiring people to believe in a shared future. Children on Earth learned about Roland's rescue in school, and his people began to call humans star friends. The once cold and empty universe was slowly becoming a place of hope. Months passed, and the Unity found more survivors from Roland's race. Each rescue added new faces, new voices, and new understanding. The crew celebrated every success quietly but with deep emotion. They knew they were writing a story that would be remembered for generations. One day, Kyle stood before the crew and said, "You saved more than our bodies. You saved our spirit and gave us reason to believe again." The humans clapped and some even cried. When the mission reached its final stage, Roland decided to send one last message to both Earth and his people. He spoke simply, saying, "I was once alone in the dark waiting for a voice, and I heard one. It spoke with kindness and courage, and it gave me life again. If we can reach across the stars, then nothing is impossible. Let this journey be the beginning, not the end." The message was sent across the galaxy, carried by light waves that would travel for centuries, touching countless worlds. The Unity turned slowly toward home, carrying its passengers, human and alien, together side by side. The stars around them shone brighter than ever, and the silence of space no longer felt cold. It felt alive, full of stories and promise. As Earth came into view once again, Roland stood quietly watching the blue planet glow. He remembered the first time he saw it. From the horizon, how distant it had felt and how strange the humans had seemed. But now it felt familiar, like a second home. Grant came to stand beside him and said, "Welcome back, my friend." Roland smiled softly and said, "It feels like coming home." The ship entered orbit and cheers filled the air, both on board and across Earth. Millions watched the live feed, seeing humans and aliens together. For the first time, not as strangers, but as family. Roland looked around at the faces of the crew and felt peace in his heart. He knew that this was only the beginning. There were still many lost voices out there waiting for help, but now he was certain they would be heard. As the ship descended through the clouds toward the landing site, the sunlight caught its silver hull, making it shine like a star. Roland closed his eyes and whispered a quiet promise to the universe. "We will keep the light alive always." The engines roared softly, and the ship touched down safely. The crowd outside cheered. The story that began with loneliness and despair had become one of unity and hope. And somewhere deep in space, far beyond where their eyes could reach, another signal blinked faintly, waiting to be found, and the humans and their new friends were ready to answer once again.